Welcome, everyone. I assume you're all here because either you're an avid Trump supporter or a member of the deep state. So let's see a show of hands. Deep state people first. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming out on this bright and sunny day to talk about a very dark topic. My name is David Talbot. Thank you. And until this week, I was a columnist for the Chronicle. But I will not be anymore. Seriously, I'm moving on. And but it's been a fun 6 months, hasn't it? The Chronicles chose not to renew my 3 times a week column, but I will be writing once a week for a bit longer. So, but I'm going to be disappearing for a month. So if I'm gone, don't assume I'm in an undisclosed location with the deep state. I'm on vacation. Anyway, as I say, I'm an ex-columnist for the Chronicle, David Talbot, and founder of Salon and author of a couple books about the deep state, The Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, and The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. I am so delighted to be on stage today with these 2 gentlemen on my left and right, and you shouldn't assume anything politically from that. And we're here, I should say right up front, by the way, because bills have to be paid, and the wonderful people at the Bay Area Book Festival have done such a colossal job of organizing this and raising funds and scratching money together where they can. And so we all want to thank Stephen M. Silverstein Foundation, for the support of this session, and Steve has been a wonderful advocate and generous supporter of this entire festival. Got some sirens there. We'll let those die down. So as I said, I'm sitting here between 2 lions, as I describe them, of radical scholarship and journalism. On my left, Peter Dale Scott. And on my right, Robert Scheer. And I'm so proud to be with these 2 gentlemen today, and I know all of Berkeley is proud of their roots in this community. Starting with Peter. Peter Dale Scott did not invent the term deep state, but he has certainly done more than anyone else in this country to expose and define its American context. Certainly more than any other scholar, including his book, The American Deep State, Big Money, Big Oil, and the Struggle for U.S. Democracy. And by the way, a new edition of this book has just been released in paperback with a preface that explores our theme today, Trump versus the deep state. Scott, who was born in Canada, served his native country as a diplomat in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. A prize-winning poet, he taught English literature for many years at UC Berkeley. And his book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, was perhaps the only masterpiece on this subject produced by an academic. And it guided my own research as I worked on Brothers and the Devil's Chessboard. Robert Scheer is also an inspiration to generations of progressive journalists, including me. When I was in military prep school in Los Angeles, I had to read Ramparts hidden behind a textbook in study hall, or I would have been busted. Seriously. The magazine, edited by Scheer and the late Warren Hinkle, captured and shaped the tumultuous events of the 1960s more than any other publication of its time. Just one example, it was Rampart's shocking photo essay on the children of Vietnam, who were wounded, burned, and horribly disfigured by American napalm bombs that provoked Martin Luther King Jr. to finally denounce the war in his passionate, historic speech at Riverside Church in New York City exactly 1 year to the day before his assassination. After Ramparts, Scheer went on to a distinguished career in what we all used to call the straight media, as a national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and magazines like Esquire and Playboy. He interviewed presidents including Nixon, Reagan, and Carter, and he covered what we all thought at the time was the end of the Cold War. Remember that? Brief, wasn't it? He is the author of numerous books, including his latest, They Know Everything About You, which shines a light on our massive surveillance state. And he's written a preface for a book that will be published later this month, a very important book, a series of interviews of Vladimir Putin. You might have heard of him lately in the news, conducted by filmmaker Oliver Stone in Moscow. Scheer is also the founder of TruthDig, an essential online publication. Co-founder, rather.
I don't want to be fired the way you were, you know. Zway Kaufman, our publisher, is also here. And
co-founder. Well, let me clarify that, Bob. I was not fired. There was a mutual parting of the ways.
Okay. I don't want one of those either, you know.
We're all being discreet here today. Anyway, TruthDig, very important publication that features, among many others, the work of leading writers like Chris Hedges. So I am going to, yes, applause. So I'm going to start today by asking Peter first, and then Bob, to speak for a few minutes on this general theme of Trump versus the deep state that is embroiling not just the Rachel Maddow show, but the entire country, it seems. And Peter's going to speak for a few minutes, as I say, and then Bob, and then I'm going to ask them a few of my own very pointed questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. So, Peter?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. It's true. I did not invent the term deep state. It came from Turkey. I do think that I was the first to apply it to the American state in my book, The Road to 9/11, back in 2006. And I must say it's a very strange sensation to use an exotic term which you think nobody's going to notice, and then suddenly it's on the internet and in the headlines of the papers day after day after day. But the deep state they're talking about is a kind of puny equivalent to the deep state that I was talking about, which you get the original subtitle was Wall Street, Big Oil, and the War on American Democracy. In the new paperback. I just got my copy on Friday. It's very new. I hope they have it for signing here. The subtitle is Big Money, because Wall Street is only one of the money players now. Big Oil and the struggle for American democracy, because the book is an appeal for us to do something about the situation we're in. Now, it's true that on one level, this meme, you see it everywhere, Trump versus the deep state, it is a real issue. I mean, Trump is a stranger to politics. He did vow to drain the swamp, and now, strange to relate, he's being troubled by leaks, just like Nixon was. And so there is a real contest between these two. But on a deeper and I think more serious level, I think that Trump versus the deep state is a diversion, because the real enemy of the deep state is not Trump. After all, Trump, he started as an outsider. The moment his campaign got moving, he got a finance chairman from Goldman Sachs. And we were able to predict way back then, last fall, that the next Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, we would have another Goldman Sachs Treasury Secretary, as we've had 3 out of the last 4 administrations. So from that angle, it's not so very new. And the fact that Goldman Sachs covered the bases by the Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, backed Hillary Clinton. So no matter who won, Goldman Sachs was going to win, and they are in charge of the Treasury now. But the real enemy is us, and the deep state has been very, very busy since the Vietnam War, making sure that there will never again be an anti-war movement that can prevent America from conducting an unjust war. And I want to quote from my book. The United States is now spending billions every year on homeland security, in no small part because of the belief articulated by Marine Colonel Oliver North, a big player in the deep state, by the way, that the Vietnam War was lost in the streets of America, not in Vietnam, and that the deterrent to U.S. military operations needed to be dealt with. So in my book, I try to show how the deep state, guided by Rumsfeld and Cheney, has pushed the Republican Party ever since 1975, first into the Reagan Revolution, then Iran-Contra, then 9/11, and then in response to 9/11, the proclamation of a state of emergency that is still with us. Now, I'm going to do a little research here. How many people in this gathering knew that we are currently in a state of emergency and that this is very important? And how many did not know? Well, you should know. If you don't buy my book, you should buy somebody's book. Because, let me tell you a little bit, and again, I'm quoting from a post, this is going up on the web today, I think. Since 9/11, this is all because of the state of emergency. Since 9/11, the Army, in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, now plays a significant ongoing role in homeland security. This includes the surveillance of U.S. citizens and the permanent domestic deployment since 2008 of a U.S. Army Brigade combat team, which can be, and this is a quotation from an Army publication, can be called upon to help with civil unrest and crowd control, or what the Army calls civil support operations. In other words, if you go out there and protest the war, this is something for the Army to deal with now. And I think that's one of the reasons that all of us being surveilled and so on don't go to as many demonstrations, although the wars certainly continue. And also, after 9/11, as I say in The Road to 9/11, that we had within weeks the Department of Homeland Security's Project Endgame, a 10-year plan to expand detention camps at a cost of $400 million in fiscal year 2007 alone. So now organizers face the risk of possible internment and confinement, since the Army Field Manual, section 3.39, paragraph 2-40, dealing with detention camps in the battlefield, now also envisages using them for, quote, I/R, that's internment resettlement, meaning detention, tasks performed in support of civil support operations. The Army should not be involved in domestic homeland security. That's what happened in Poland in 1981, and it was a necessary first step to the martial law that crushed the Solidarity movement back in 1981. We don't want that sort of thing to happen here. Now, there's a lot wrong in America, and this has led to deep divisions, including the struggle between the alt-knights and the Black Bloc that took place right in this very turf a few weeks ago. The Trump versus the deep state phenomenon is not so much a cause as a reflection of these problems and these divisions. The real problem being the corruption of our politics by big money And the big money, you see, the only thing that ever restrains big money is a vigorous popular protest against it, and the deep state has taken many, many measures to make that kind of protest more and more difficult. So the media deplore the Trump versus the deep state struggle as harmful, but as Glenn Greenwald has said, both Trump and the deep state are dangerous. And so, as I wrote, let them attack each other. And I quoted, this is checks and balances at work. And it's the way it worked after Nixon, too. In a sense, this is a kind of replay of what happened when Nixon also got into trouble with the deep state. But I quoted what David quoted from Leonard Cohen, "That's how the light gets in." So what are we going to do?
There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
Yeah. What are we going to do? In my book, I say we might need a much bigger Occupy movement, one at many levels of society, that will appeal to a broad spectrum of the American electorate, both on the left and on the right. And as a first step, we need to get our politics back from the hands of the deep state. And as a first step to that, we need to end this state of emergency that is responsible for so much of what's gone wrong since 2001.
Thank you, Peter. And now, Bob.
Yeah, God, I can't get over you're being fired, but you're not allowed to call it that.
No. That's fake. That's fake news.
Okay. It's interesting because I had a wonderful 29 years at the LA Times as a national correspondent and as a columnist, and then the Tribune Company bought the paper, and there's a fellow who became the publisher, and he fired me because he told people he couldn't stand any single word I ever wrote, and he's now the publisher of the San Francisco Chronicle, Jeff Johnson, and I love this festival. I love everything about it, and I love Sherilyn Parsons, who I've known ever since her USC days, and when my wife started the LA Times Festival of Books. And the only thing I don't like is every time I come to the reception, we have to give thanks to Jeff Johnson. And it's a little bit awkward for me because the son of a bitch fired me. But anyway, I'm happy that we have this stage and this opportunity. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets through. I do want to say something about the mass media. I went from Ramparts to the LA Times, basically, and I must say I didn't find the quality of life very different. And I mean that in a sincere way. At Ramparts, Warren Hinkle, who really should be admired as one of the great figures in American journalism, had a traditional education in journalism and from the Catholic Church and the University of San Francisco and the Jesuits and everything else.
And the Chronicle.
And ended up with the Examiner. And he really believed in journalism. He believed in it. And he believed it should matter, and he had a sense of social justice, and that should not be obscured by his tendency to drink, or maybe it was informed by his tendency to drink. I don't know. I'm not Irish. My main response to Hinkle was always to, because I grew up in the Bronx, to assure him that I did not kill his lord. So much for conspiracies. But I do want to say that I think really, Adam Hochschild, there are a lot of such great people at Ramparts. We were doing journalism. The problem is the Main Street media was not. And that's why King had to go to Ramparts to see what we were doing to children of Vietnam. And I must say, in terms of conspiracy theories, which will be the subtext here, I was always the conservative at Ramparts. And I came from a school of journalism of I.F. Stone and others, and growing up reading the New York Post and PM and everything else. Whereas I couldn't document it by going to the New York Times, it probably wasn't true. And that was called research. And I had to unlearn that habit that was forced upon me in the New York public school system. And so Peter reminded me that the last time we were together, we were on a panel that it was the two of us and David Horowitz, and it was
KPFA
panel.
Yes.
And that was shortly before Horowitz fired me from Ramparts. I've been fired by some of the best, you know. And I was fired from Ramparts because I wasn't radical enough. I had the crime of being bourgeois and wanting to, you know, I grew up poor and I wanted to have a decent life. So Horowitz objected to that. He was a pure Trotskyist in those days.
He is a decent.
And at any rate, I do remember in Ramparts, I was the guy who kept telling Hinkle that Garrison was wrong and we shouldn't fall for conspiracy theories and blah, blah, blah. And I remember one thing in particular. I had been in Vietnam, and I'm writing about it, and there had been something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And there were people telling me that the second attack particularly had never happened. And I was the schmuck at Ramparts who said, of course it happened. You can't keep these things secret, right? Somebody would tell us. Somebody would know. There were thousands of people who knew, okay? So 20 years after the Gulf of Tonkin, I'm at the Los Angeles Times, and we had a very good publisher, Tom Johnson, who had been in the White House at that time and very close to the Johnson family, went on to run their radio stations and went on to be head of CNN after he was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. And I got a hold of some documents that were finally released on the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And it turned out that the conspiracy nuts were right. There had not been a second Gulf of Tonkin attack. Maybe there wasn't a first, but there certainly wasn't a second. And in fact, when you read the declassified document, you found out quite a few people knew. Lyndon Johnson knew when he went on television to tell us we've been attacked. He knew that the Admiral Maddox, of the Maddox, the captain, and of the Ticonderoga, they were all saying there was no attack. We have no evidence. We think our radar picked it up wrong. Be cautious, et cetera, et cetera. We knew that the command post in San Diego knew that. We knew right up and down the line. Yet they went on television because it was too good to check. It's what they had been looking for, and it became the excuse to expand the war and attack North Vietnam. And ironically, the other day, when John McCain, who was shot down over Vietnam, said that Vladimir Putin is more dangerous than ISIS, a statement, by the way, should disqualify him from any polite conversation, right, let alone being a U.S. senator. But when he said that, I thought, you know, why do we even pay attention to McCain? Because, as our current president pointed out, he had the achievement of being shot down. But the fact of the matter is he shouldn't have been over Vietnam. He was over there because of fake news. He was over there because of conspiracy. He was over there because of the deep state, okay? And the person who was first to recognize that, and I'm blocking on his name, but he's the admiral that ran with Ross Perot. Stockdale.
He said, why am I here? Remember during the debate?
Well, see, everybody remembers Stockdale as a joke because the mass media made a joke of him. But Stockdale actually wrote a wonderful book. And the first chapter in his book was to tell us that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a hoax. And he was shot down over Vietnam. He was the longest held POW in Vietnam. And what happened was he was flying above because he was on the Ticonderoga. He was alerted. He went over. They saw nothing. There was nothing. There was no evidence of an attack. He went back to his boat and went to sleep. They woke him up 4 or 5 hours later, and they said, you got to get in your plane. We're bombing North Vietnam. He said, what for? And they said, because of the attack last night. He said, there was no attack. Well, he had to keep that secret right through his whole prison sentence in North Vietnam. And finally told about that story in his book when these documents were released. I interviewed the captain of the Maddox. He told me the same thing. He knew there was no attack. He had to keep the secret. So the thing about a deep state, understand, is there are a lot of people of goodwill who will go along with a lie for a very long time, all right? And the thing about whistleblowers, whether it be Daniel Ellsberg or Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning or anyone else, is how rare they are. How rare they are. Daniel Ellsberg, who supported the war in Vietnam, when I read the Pentagon Papers, and I was a defense witness if there had been a trial. I had written quite a bit about all this by that time. There wasn't anything I didn't know, and in fact, much of it, as Daniel has pointed out, I had already written. But the fact is, they had a good, established, official record based on documented sources, real news, real truth. Thousands of people had read it. It was a Pentagon study. It had footnotes. It was documented. None of them told us. None of the people at the Rand Corporation, none of the people in the Pentagon, none of the people in the universities who had worked on this. Tens of thousands of people knew what Daniel Ellsberg knew. And Daniel Ellsberg said, the American people have a right and a need to know this. Tony Russo, who was at the Rand Corporation, I knew the story quite intimately because I was covering it at the time. Tony Russo was a guy working at the Rand Corporation whose job was reading the interrogation of prisoners of war in South Vietnam who had been tortured quite often. Torture is not new. Tony Russo was offended by that. Tony Russo, when he read the Pentagon Papers, said, this war makes no sense. It's a tissue of lies. It could not be justified, so why are we torturing people in their own country? To try to get him to support No Din Diem, a dictator. And Tony Russo teamed up with Daniel Ellsberg to take it down to a travel shop that had one Xerox machine and tape this night after night after night to make copies and release it, for which he faced, what I forget now, 130 years in jail. All right? Think of the number of people that knew what they knew, that had read that report but kept silent, okay? Think of the people who knew what Edward Snowden has revealed. Think of Adam Schiff, who's now a big hero and may run for Senate or something, right? He was the top-ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee in the House. He knew all of this. He knew about torture. He knew about the surveillance state, you know? So I want to conclude on one point. I know you think I'm going on long. But the thing about the deep state, I'm going to make two comments about it, okay? One is we've always had a deep state.
Amen.
But the deep state is now on speed, and that's because of the surveillance society. The deep state now has, what they did to Martin Luther King, that was the deep state. That was the FBI, which liberals are now celebrating. Yeah. Let the FBI celebrate. But it was the FBI that tried to kill King. They're the ones who made the phony documents. They're the ones who wanted to get him to commit suicide. That record, and I'm reading his book, by the way. I learned something about the CIA that I didn't know. I learned that James Jesus Angleton, who's featured quite prominently in his book, was a guy who had a hard-on for me. You know, I mean, this is a guy who wanted to destroy ramparts and in the CIA. And this is a guy we were followed all the time by both the CIA and the FBI. And by the way, as a personal note, I was exonerated by J. Edgar Hoover. There's something called the Scheer file in 1972, and the big fight developed between the CIA and the FBI about whether I was an agent of some foreign government, and they couldn't find any government because as soon as they settled on one, I would denounce it. And so the FBI agents in San Francisco said, no, this guy Scheer, like Mario Savio, this stuff in the book on surveillance, very good book, Mario Savio, others. Scheer's just a good time Charlie. He just wants to find girls or something, you know. He's denounced in every single group that we've infiltrated, you know. And so finally, J. Edgar Hoover came back from Washington. They said, well, plant some drugs on him. And the guys in San Francisco had the wisdom to say, are you kidding? We'll make him a national hero. And so there is actually correspondence I finally got from the Freedom of Information where J. Edgar Hoover tells these folks that he wrote about in his marvelous book, James, said that he's closing the Scheer case, closing my file because he's not an enemy agent, and the CIA accused Hoover of betraying the security of the country. So I want to make one other point. The deep state is now on speed. It has all this vast information. They don't have to be parked in the car and second. The other thing that scares the hell out of me is the demonization, the red scare that we have when we don't even have a red. Mm-hmm. One thing that is made very clear in Oliver Stone's interview with Putin, he's an anti-communist, okay? This guy is a Russian nationalist, orthodox. You can blast him any which way you want, but he goes back to, you know, you got to read Dostoevsky to understand him. It's not Karl Marx, okay? And it's a brilliant documentary, I think. I wrote the preface to the text of it. But the thing that scares me right now, because of the whole Trump thing, is that red baiting is in fashion, even without a red. And so we can sell an enormous amount of arms to Saudi Arabia that beheads people for being gay, but we can't have negotiations with Putin because of what's happening to gay people in Chechnya. I'm opposed to what's happening to gay people in Chechnya, but don't have this bullshit double standard. We negotiate and get along with a lot of people in this world that have worse records than Putin. And my final point on that, because I do an internet publication, and I know a great deal about the internet and how it works, and that's what my surveillance book is all about. Anybody who, if Putin, I know there's still no evidence of their doing what they're accused of doing in an election. As far as I know, the issue really has to do with the documents of DNC and Hillary Clinton's speech to Goldman Sachs, which I would argue we had a right to have and should have had and all along. But blaming this election not on the failure of the Democratic leadership, but on Russians is bullshit. But if they didn't use those tools, there's something wrong with them. Because the U.S. has set the standard for every government in the world. We tap everyone and everything. We have the most massive surveillance system the world could ever imagine. No dictator in this world could have imagined having these tools of surveillance, okay? And so on that point, let's not be naive. This whole red baiting thing is a way of taking attention from the Snowden revelations and our deep state, and it's the deep state getting its revenge, saying, see, you need us to protect you. Right. And it's bullshit.
Thank you, Bob. So I want to pick up on that last point and open this up to Peter and then to Bob to have a little discussion. Let's not forget that one of the original scholars of the American power structure was C. Wright Mills, long before the term deep state ever became popular. And C. Wright Mills, who was a great sociologist at Columbia University during the Cold War, did have a broader conception of what the power elite, the deep state, was than it's come to mean. And Peter was rightly saying it's become too narrow to suggest that it's just security agencies. No, it's Wall Street, it's the oil industry, and it's the corporate media. So I'm just appalled by watching the so-called liberal news, cable news channel every night of the week. Rachel Maddow, Brian Williams, Larry O'Donnell, and so on. And it's just a cavalcade, wall-to-wall parade, for the most part, of national security people. Ex-CIA guys, generals, people from national security think tanks. It's unbelievable. It's as if the deep state now has its own news channel, 24/7. So I wanted to ask you all, both of you, and I want to start with you, Peter. Obviously one of the key themes now of MSNBC and the liberal media is that Russia subverted the election. Russia is behind the Trump presidency, using Russia as a club to rid the country of Trump. And liberals wildly cheering this on. As Bob said,
right.
When did the FBI suddenly become our heroes and the CIA?
Well,
but you do have all these liberal commentators almost uniformly lining up on the side of these security officials. And what I want to get at is what is going on. I understand the desire to get rid of Trump and why liberals are cheering that on. But there's something deeper at work about this new Russophobia. It's not a Red Scare, as Bob said, because there are no communists left in the Kremlin. But what is behind this new anti-Russian hysteria, do you think, Peter? What's going on at a deeper level here?
Well, I'm a bit stymied because, unlike some people, I think we really do need to know. I welcome the idea of an investigation of Trump-Putin contacts before the election. I don't know what they are. They may have been totally benign. They might have been about money, or they might have been about ways to throw the election. Coming back to Rachel Maddow, she's sick right now, but her replacement, I think it was last night or the night before, very, very worried that the Trump people, and then, yes, they brought in military and CIA people to back them up on this, that Trump would offer to lift the sanctions on Russia and to do so unilaterally. I don't know what the I'm sure it was a quid pro quo, and I don't know whether the other side of it was legitimate or illegitimate, but I do know, at least I feel very strongly, that those sanctions are uncalled for. It goes back to the Crimea and Ukraine. I read a book written by an Australian who went on horseback from Tibet to Hungary, and he rode through Crimea. And he was talking about how the Russians there were furious at the Ukrainian government because they were Russian speakers and they could not go to school in Russian. They had to go in school and speak Ukrainian. So it is hardly a surprise that Crimea would want to throw off the Ukrainian occupation. That's what it was, a deal made by Khrushchev to strengthen the pro-Moscow vote in the Ukraine against the West, which was passionately anti-Russian. So those sanctions were wrong to begin with. And when it comes to Ukraine, I would say both sides, both America and Russia, have been intervening in rather similar ways. And so I think it is... It's just false for us to say, oh, they've done something wrong here. Actually, the Minsk Accords, which are holding a tenuous peace in Ukraine, were primarily negotiated by Putin and have saved lives. He has a better record in Ukraine, I would say, than the people around Hillary when she was Secretary of State do, Victoria Nuland and people like that. So, anyway, come back, it is sad to me. My wife loves Rachel Maddow. My wife feels Rachel Maddow is a hero. But, and I enjoy listening to her, but I don't enjoy listening to her because what she says about Russia is pretty exactly what Hillary would be saying about Russia if she were president, which makes me, I'm not happy that Trump is our president, but I'm also quite relieved that Hillary is not our president, because I think the chances of World War III in Syria, wherever, maybe the Ukraine itself, would be significantly greater. That's the trouble with when the deep state gets control of both political parties. And so you have a campaign in 2008 where both McCain and Obama were saying they wanted to fight the good war in Afghanistan. And the good war is Vietnam done all over again, above all, with the role of drugs and everything else, which is the mainstay of the Kabul economy now. The main thing about Afghanistan, just like Vietnam, is you cannot win against a people that's united in wanting you out. So we have to...
But Peter, and Bob, I wanted to ask, is there just a kind of relentless will to war that the deep state has because the economy is so militarized? I mean, President Eisenhower warned us many years ago about the military-industrial complex, yeah. But talk about the deep state being on speed. At this point, the military-industrial complex is a quaint concept because the entire economy has been so thoroughly militarized in a way. So many sectors of the economy linked to war and oil, and of course we know how those are linked. So it seems to me that despite the sort of brief period of détente we had after the wall came down, and then, of course, we had 9/11 to sort of give us justification for a permanent state of war and permanent state of alert.
Emergency.
Now that seems to be sort of also wearing thin for the American people. Where these wars in remote places in the Middle East, we're not quite certain how it connects to us. But there's the good old Russia, the bear, the big bear again, and it seems like a more kind of realistic enemy in some ways than some nameless terrorists hiding out in the Middle East. What do you think, Bob? Is there a kind of inevitable will that the militarized economy, the deep state has to have these kind of enemies to justify the expenditures on war and the defense industry?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, let me just say something. I realize I went on a bit long before, and I don't want to do that, but I've written 3 books. I don't know if they're for sale here or not. I'm not getting any younger, and I'm tired of writing these goddamn things if nobody reads them. Just in the last decade, I've written 13 altogether, not to brag. I wrote one called The Pornography of Power, and what it was about was America before 9/11 and after. The first President Bush came in and said, the Cold War is over, we should cut the military budget immediately by 30%, 40%. Immediately. There's no reason for it, no reason for the sophisticated weapons. Yeah, there's terrorists, but they're out in the desert. You can't use your aircraft carriers, you can't use your snubs, and so forth. There's no reason. We don't have an enemy, and so forth. A guy gave a speech at that time, which I opened my book with, where he said, there's a big enemy in the world now. It's not the old Soviet Union, and it's not even China, and it's not this and this. And he goes through the whole speech. He said, the big enemy is the Pentagon. It's in this building. The speech was given by Donald Rumsfeld. He was head of the building. He'd taken over. 2 days later or 3 days later, 9/11 happens. All bets are off, okay? And there's a reassertion of the need for the militarized society. It has nothing to do with national security threats. It involves weaponry that has nothing to do with it. And as fact, as we know, really know in terms of big weaponry, the real issue is to have arms control agreements with the Soviets over those goddamn nuclear weapons and over nuclear proliferation. And that you never hear from the liberal critics of Trump. That's the real danger. The son of a bitch has his finger on the button, and you got to ask the question, why did we ever give any president the right to destroy all life on this planet probably in a half hour? Why haven't we attended to this? You know, did we not think? Did we not know Nixon was drunk one night or on drugs? Did we not know that Lyndon Johnson was irrational? Did we go through the whole list? You know, just to be bipartisan here, that Jack Kennedy was with some gangster mall having a good time, and he's alerted. You got 15 minutes to decide. So yes, it's scary, and we're not attending to the real possibilities of developing a safer arms control regime with the Soviets, which we were on track to do, okay? But I just want to mention one thing about fake news and real news, because that's very much in the air now, and folks like us will be attacked for being fake news. So the other day I read an AP story. One of the things I do now in my unpaid gig, by the way, if you want to help Truthdig, send money, but I can't be fired there because I'm not paid. But the thing is, I'm up editing this thing because we have a correspondent in London and in New York and so forth. And so I'm there, and I read an AP story, and it's about Russia and how evil they are and Putin, and they've had some military exercise in the Kuril Islands and near southern Sakhalin. And the reference in the AP stories, you know, that were invaded by Russia, by Soviet Union, and there's the irritation with Japan. So I thought, this is nuts. What does it mean they invaded? Let me go dig out my Yalta Agreement. As I tell my students at USC, you can check things now. You know, the internet has this virtue. So I pulled up the Yalta document, and I just want to read one thing that seems not known to any one of these people anymore. And it says that the former rights of Russia violated by the treacherous attack of Japan in 1904 shall be restored. The southern part of Sakhalin, as well as the islands adjacent to it, shall be returned to the Soviet Union. That's Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. That's the wartime agreement. Now, the reason I bring it up is a kid in the Bronx, going over to City College, living with my garment worker mother, impressed as hell with the New York Times, which ignored the decline of the Bronx and its burning and everything else later, another story. I remember reading an editorial in the New York Times blasting them. And I also remember that the Yalta Agreement had finally been declassified. You could read it. So I went to the 42nd Street Library and I read it. And I wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, oh, guys, you made a mistake. There are supposed to be in the Kuril Islands, the southern Kuril Islands, and in southern Sakhalin. Oh, there's an error. Surely you'll correct it. I wrote 5 goddamn letters to the New York Times. I went to Samuel Hendel, the chairman of our department of City College, a highly regarded fellow. I said, why aren't they printing this? They don't have to, was his answer. And they never did. And the story I told before about the Gulf of Tonkin, my publisher was in the White House when Lyndon Johnson gave this speech. So was Bill Moyers, by the way. Did they know it? I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, truth and truthful news is not the norm for the mainstream media. That's a fiction.
Very true. All right, look, I'm going to ask one more quick question, just quick responses from each gentleman, and then we're going to open it up to you. We're talking about the deep state today as if it's a monolith, and of course it's not, right, Peter? I mean, there's fractions within the deep state itself, not just between the deep state and Trump. Michael Glennon, in a former aide for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote, I think, a very provocative piece, which some of you might have seen on the cover of Harper's Magazine, the current issue. And it was about the deep state duel with Trump. And he lays out one of the most frightening scenarios is that there actually could be an alliance at some point if Trump were a little more sophisticated, perhaps, as a president, as a strategist like Nixon was, and that Trump could actually peel off or align himself with some of the more aggressive and repressive elements of the deep state. And then, according to Glenn, we would truly have a nightmare. Peter, what do you think about the sense that you raised the question that there's a crack in everything, it lets the light get in? That's a benevolent view of what could happen as we sit back and watch Godzilla fight Mothra here, these two giants, and hope for the best. But there could be something a little bit darker, according to this scenario in Harper's. If Trump, as he says, makes an alignment with elements of the deep state that are the scariest elements. And what do you think the likelihood for that kind of development would be, Peter?
Well, I don't like predicting, but I will say that if it were to happen, I wouldn't get too scared because, I'm a Canadian and single nationality Canadian, but I think I believe in America at this point than nearly all of my American friends do. I think the American system is so complex, so articulated, that you cannot have one maverick run off with what's left of the Constitution and scrap it. Supposing there is the alignment, you talk about it, you will get a rebellion in Congress, in some of the media, in the internet, which is a big new player on both sides. I mean, it's a big player in surveillance, and it's a big player in learning more about what the deep state is doing. So I don't think Trump has it in his hands to put an end to America as we knew it. I see that the title of this thing is what, Showdown? No, it's just one more chapter in the messy business of American politics. I do want to, one more thing, and it's really in response to what Bob was saying about 9/11 and what happened after that. Of the many definitions out about the deep state, I think mine is the only one that is close to the original Turkish definition, which is talking about sinister forces that will do really sinister things. And in my book, I'm saying that the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, 9/11, and even Iran-Contra in a different way, all of them were, in one way or another, came out of the deep state against the state. And so I talk about deep events. And in my view of things, what the biggest constitutional event in this millennium was 9/11, and not by accident. Not by accident. People wanted, maybe you don't know, some of you, that Cheney and Rumsfeld had been planning for 20 years secretly with a huge budget, planning for a suspension of parts of the American Constitution in a program called Continuity of Government, COG. And those two men, while Bush was down in Tampa, Florida, and later in Louisiana, and later in Iowa, Nebraska, those two men implemented on 9/11 the COG plans, which they had been working on for 20 years. That's the part of the deep state that worries me, not somebody like Trump who comes along and is a relative outsider. I don't think we need to worry about Rumsfeld anymore. I watched Cheney very closely. That man did so much, starting in 1975, when he pushed Rockefeller out of the Republican leadership and opened the door to Reagan and the Reagan Revolution. These are people who knew what they were doing on a long term, and they are the people that we have to plan against and organize against.
And Bob, what about this dark alliance between Trump and some of the scarier elements of the deep state? Today, we just see that Wall Street took a big bounce after his decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Pact. So not all of Wall Street is against him. And, you know, he has people like General McMaster, Mad Dog McMaster, and others who might be his links to some of the more bellicose elements of the deep state. How do you see this playing out?
Look, I'm all for stressing the lesser evil. I have voted for more warmongers than you can imagine. I was denounced by some of my friends on the left because I ran as a Democrat for Congress here in this district against a good liberal who unfortunately wouldn't stop supporting the Vietnam War. And then finally we got Dellums in. So I understand the fear out there. I live in Los Angeles, and I can't stand the attack on undocumented people. It's a pogrom. It's a pogrom. I can get very emotional about it. So I understand how much damage Trump can do. I also understand how damaging the lesser evil fear is, because it stops thought. Right now, the left is dead. There is no peace movement. Everybody is focused on Trump and what damage he can do. And I look back at my own life, and the real damage, the major damage, was not partisan. It was bipartisan. And I think of one guy, I know I'm going on, but let me just one little note here. I really like Jimmy Carter. I interviewed Jimmy Carter for Playboy. I may have made his life miserable with my Playboy interview about lust, but I thought it was a very human statement. I always felt guilty about it. I've talked to him over the years. I think he's been the greatest ex-president we ever had. And yet, following one of my mentors here, Peter Dale Scott, doing the research, doing the homework, digging, I discovered, not alone, I'm not the first person, that this whole crap with terrorism and Muslim and everything else can be traced, I don't want to be too simplistic here, but the decision to give Russia or Soviet Union its Vietnam in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. We don't have time to visit that now, but the record is damn clear. Just go get the Nouvelle Observatoire. This is in my book on the pornography power, but get the Nouvelle Observatoire interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, where he said, yes, we gave the Russians their Vietnam. What's more important, a few riled up Muslims or the end of the Soviet Union? Okay, you want to talk about deep state and so forth. Freedom fighters brought there. That's how they couldn't find enough nuts in Afghanistan. The CIA had to recruit them from all over the world and bring them there, you know. That's a record. Had to be armored. Had to be given Stinger rockets. The whole bloody mess that we're in that now controls us. How do you fight terrorism? How do you fight? Well, one thing you do is you don't create it in the first place, okay?
Good way to end. All right, we're going to open it to you. We have time for a few questions. And this gentleman with the microphone is going to come to you.
To Robert, what is the name of your internet publication?
The name of Bob's internet publication.
Truthdig.com. Truthdig. Digging for the truth. It doesn't mean we have the truth. We're doing what journalists are supposed to do. And I took it as an archaeological model. And by the way, Orville Schell, the former distinguished dean of your journalism school here, was our first contributor to a truth dig. So we have had quite a bit of variety. And we're basically run on the editorial side by people who came from the LA Times and were mainstream journalists.
Not sure I understand what the versus is in Trump versus the deep state, because to me, with Trump's cabinet, or like I call them the board of directors, these are all billionaires or millionaires who have big tentacles in major big business and Wall Street and oil. etc. So I think it's Trump and the big state. That's my comment. And I have a very simple question to Robert Scheer. Why are you no longer on left, right, and center?
Good. Wait, hold on to that. That's a good one.
Okay.
Peter, why don't you answer the first one?
All right, yes. The new edition has a long essay which is essentially looking at the deep state and Trump. The deep state are everywhere. Trump did come in from the outside. He was a self-propelled maverick at the beginning. When it got big, he got the Mercer family to back him. They are very powerful in Wall Street. It's a section of Wall Street, but outside. And then when he got bigger still, then that's when Goldman Sachs provided a finance chairman who is now the Treasury Secretary. So you cannot really say Trump versus the deep state. David referred to the fact that there's not only a little bit about it in this book, that there are different factions in the deep state, and they go way, way back. It's not new. And it's always been essentially the internationalists, the people who want to work with the banks in Geneva and London, versus the nationalists who just want to exploit ranches in Mexico and so on. And that was that conflict that produced the John Birch Society in 1958, I think. And a very good journalist on the left referred to this as a populist movement. Well, unfortunately, it was started by 12 men, all men, 11 of whom were senior officials in the National Association of Manufacturers, which represents that second nationalist kind of opinion against New York, Wall Street, and the Council on Foreign Relations.
And that's who's backing Trump's decision to withdraw from the climate pact, while Exxon and Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, were supporting the climate pact.
And Shell, too, now, as well.
So,
yes.
Bob, I'm going to just reinforce that question about left, right, and center. I always enjoyed your involvement in that show. I don't know if people are familiar with it. You were the great sort of kick-ass voice of the left, and now it's kind of mealy-mouthed. What happened?
Well, you're going to get me fired from the one gig I have left in public radio. I was given a wonderful opportunity to spend more time with my grandchildren. No. I have a program that I'm very proud of on KCRW, the station that hosted Left, Right, and Center. And it's called Sheer Intelligence. I didn't give it the name, and I have to go out of my way right away to say, and my guest, David Talbot, is the source of intelligence here, and so forth. But I love it. It's a half hour. I'm not interrupted by yammering idiots from the National Review and so forth. It was not my choice, and I think the station in its wisdom decided that people closer to Hillary Clinton properly represented the left. And since I wrote a book called The Great American Stick-Up, in which it was how Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats created the whole banking meltdown, and it was Clinton who, after all, gave us the radical deregulation of Wall Street, right? The Commodity Futures Modernization Act, the Financial Services Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which made the bundling possible and everything else. I was critical of the Clintons, even though personally I like them and they're charming. I want to make one point about the deep state. The thing that's buzzing around, we're not talking about just spooks, okay? We're talking about business that is done before the public, where the public can comprehend it, and the stuff that gets on, whether it's trade agreements, whether it's making war, or what have you. At the end of the day, they have screwed up. Their trade agreements, their foreign policy, their wars don't work. They don't work. The test is you got so many unhappy people in this country who can't make a decent living, for whom the American dream is shot, okay? Those people then turn to a Bernie Sanders, who is admirable and wonderful, or they turn to a Donald Trump, who's despicable and terrible. But they're turning out of pain. What the liberals are trying to do now is blame. They can't blame the American people, and they don't want to address their pain. They're going to do the same crap with the economy if they get in power. They're going to feed the rich. They're going to hurt the poor. They don't care about the disappearing middle class, no matter what they say, so they need a scapegoat. okay?
Hear,
That's
hear.
the thing. And they're scapegoating. Look, what did the Democratic National Committee do that the Ruskies are supposed to have released? To destroy Sanders.
Right.
After all, that's the interference, okay? And what about what was the other terrible thing? Released the text of Hillary Clinton's speech to Goldman Sachs, those $750,000 worth of words, as Bernie Sanders said, must have been some terrific speeches. What did she say in those speeches? We need you smart folks to come down to Washington and straighten out the problem. They are the people who created the problem. They invented the derivatives, the collateralized debt obligations, the credit default swap. In that very room, Lloyd Blankfein, those people invented it. She's there giving these speeches, which she doesn't want us to read, saying, you're just marvelous people, and come back and have another shot at it when I get in. Why weren't we entitled to see that? If that depended on Putin releasing it, thank God.
All right. One more question we have time for. It better be a good one. Yes. Well, we have a mic somewhere. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that the deep state consists of Wall Street and corporations. I read a long time ago that there's a committee that oversees the CIA of the CEOs of the largest corporations that actually gets more information than Congress does. Is that true, and is it still true?
I'll take it. There is something called the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. I think that's the group you're talking about. Yes, they're on the inside, not on the outside. They get clearances, they do see things, and they make recommendations. And what we know historically about their interventions, it's usually to get the CIA a little bit more in line with corporate priorities. I know most about this. It's easiest to talk about the 1950s when it was so simple. You know, big oil was primarily Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, who are also the Chase Manhattan Bank, and when the dollar, I'm coming to them, you had the Truman administration was going to prosecute the oil companies for being in a cartel, which they didn't deny. They just said, no, it's in the national interest that we're in a cartel. And they got Sullivan and Cromwell to represent them in the case, which was settled in the Eisenhower administration by the Secretary of State, who was John Foster Dulles, coming from Sullivan and Cromwell in the case, and from Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, who was also working with the oil corporations. That was the deep state when it moved smoothly, and when the opposition coming from the John Birch Society was just a little cloud on the horizon. I did a book after this one in 2016 called Dallas 63. I'll let you guess what it's about. And I say there, at that point we had a dyadic deep state because the John Birch people were gaining ground, and a great many of them and their backers figure in the book that I'm telling about were against Kennedy and his more or less mainstream Wall Street cabinet. That's a whole story we don't need to go into. But when you think about presidents versus the deep state, the two big examples are Kennedy and Nixon, and neither of them lived to fill out their term. I think that tells us something, that there's a level of politics in this country that is not taught in the universities, is never mentioned in the mainstream newspapers, and that we have to open our minds to dig deeper than what the regular channels of our country are giving us.
Thank you very much.